Achoo!
Classical music seems like an easy concept to define until you are actually asked to define it. In this video, we'll discuss the 4 most common meanings of this term and how they may conflict with each other, so next time you get into a geek argument about what classical music is, you'll have the right tools to defend your point. Let's get to it. Number 1. Classical music as whatever is not jazz, pop or folk music. This is a convenience definition attributed to the American composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein in 1959. While there is a part of irony in Bernstein's words, I consider that this definition describes very well what most people, especially non-musicians, think of when they think of classical music. Opposing classical music to jazz, pop and folk music is a negative definition, meaning we define something by what is not instead of what it is. So, in order to know what classical music is according to this definition, we are to define first what jazz, pop and folk music are, and as you may imagine, that's not an easy task either. While pop and folk labels refer to social and performative contexts, jazz, on the other hand, belongs to a completely different category, which is that of musical styles, just like blues, rock, etc.
Don't forget to mention that the pop concept is also problematic. While musicologists use the term popular musics to refer to essentially any kind of urban commercial music, for most people, pop music label describes whatever is mainstream at a given time. So at one point, jazz music was also the pop music of its time.
Another issue with this definition is that it relies too much on people's expectations. Classical music is often associated with certain types of instruments, conductors, and people dressed up. So in the end, it becomes a cliché that revolves around certain timbrical and visual elements, rather than the actual musical content. Simply put, the more of these elements you include, the more classical you'll sound. For instance, I'm pretty sure that most people, especially non-musicians, would feel comfortable with the label classical applied to John Williams music, but I highly doubt that this would still be the case for medieval Gregorian chant, which is also not pop, not jazz, and not folk. Number 2. Classical music as tonal common practice. The label common practice appears in some music theory contexts, such as Walter Piston's Harmony Treatise from 1959, and it refers to the common harmonic practices observed among Western composers between, roughly speaking, late 17th century and early 20th century, or in other words, the era of the tonality dominance in Western music history. The interesting thing about this definition is that it goes down to actual music parameters and gives an arguably valid argument on why radically different musical styles, such as, for instance, late Baroque versus late Romantic music, could be put under the same label attending to a few specific shared musical features. If you think of it, this is the criteria followed by concert halls, conservatories, and music platforms when it comes to select their classical repertoire, and anything that goes beyond that span of time is usually relegated to a different category, such as old music or contemporary music.
Be careful though, because these are problematic labels as well. Attending to the tonal common practice criteria, early music could be used to describe anything composed before the 17th century. However, from the performance perspective, early music is understood as any music for which a historically appropriate style of performance must be reconstructed on the basis of surviving scores, treatises, instruments, and other contemporary evidence. So for some, the term could be extended to the 18th or even early 19th century music as well. Contemporary classical music, on the other hand, could be simply understood as music made less than a century ago, but also as avant-garde, which is problematic when it comes to classifying certain composers from the early 20th century.
The irony of this is that many recent music, such as music for movies and other media, and even pop music, are actually closer to this definition of tonal classical music than most of the actual contemporary classical music, which is, in many cases, deliberately anti-classical. Number 3. Classical music as art, serious or academic music. Imagine you step into an art museum. What kind of artworks are you expecting to see? And what kind of artworks are you not expecting to see? This is related to the notion of high art, which is a concept developed in the 19th century, even if they didn't call it by this name, by which certain cultural products, especially those from the past, started to be regarded by general agreement as superior art forms that transcend any aesthetic judgment. This is, they are supposed to be intrinsically valuable, no matter if you like them or not, and so they need to be preserved and displayed in museums for future generations. Classical music clearly occupies this spot today, if only we change art museums for concert halls and opera theaters, while anything else that is not played in those spaces is left out, apparently as lesser forms of music, or even as not music at all.
My case against rap is, I have the musical case against rap, and then I'll get to the cultural case against rap. So the musical case against rap is that, in my view, and the view of my music theorist father who went to music school, there are three elements to music. There is harmony, there is melody, and there is rhythm. Okay. And rap only fulfills one of these, the rhythm section. That there's not a lot of melody and there's not a lot of harmony. And thus it is basically effectively spoken rhythm. And so it's not actually a form of music, it's a form of rhythmic speaking.
For some people, music styles seem to be classified according to their presumed complexity level in a kind of hierarchical system in which classical music apparently occupies the top spot. But before assuming these thoughts in a non-critical way, it's important to consider the following questions. First, the equivalence between complexity and quality is purely subjective and cannot be stated as a universal rule. Second, there is not an exclusive relationship between complexity and classical music. Complexity exists outside of the classical music as simplicity exists inside as well. In the end, the validation of a musical work as part of the art music label relies on a cultural agreement, an academic consensus which criteria can change over time depending on multiple historical, aesthetic, and socioeconomic factors, beyond the musical content itself. For this reason, some musicologists tend to avoid terms like art or serious music, and rather use the more descriptive label academic music instead, even if it isn't perfect either.
That's right. This tag implies that there is some sort of institutional pedagogical tradition behind, which is right for classical music, but it's not exclusive to it anymore. But let's go back to the art music definition.
We could divide this particular definition of classical music in two different categories. First, those musical works that were retroactively put into this label, encompassing a lot of different musical periods and composers. This is music that was created with a different purpose in mind, whether it was meant for church service, teaching tools, or entertainment, and that only after the composer's death, sometimes centuries later, someone decided to include into this kind of musical museums that are the concert halls. In these cases, the composers had no role in their music's resignification process, as the very concept of classical music as we understand it today, was completely alien for them.
But now that I'm dying young, I'll be cool forever. Eat my pantaloons!
We can even argue if some of these composers would actually stand against the way we perform and listen to their music today. For instance, the case of sacred music being played out of the church and with a commercial purpose in mind. On the second group, we've got music that was created with the actual intention of becoming high art music in the contemporary sense, something that only started to happen in the early 20th century and that led to a split among classical music public. Some people consider these new compositions as a valid continuation of the classical traditions, but for others they were simply too new, too pretentious, and sometimes not even good at all. After all, if your music is going to be labeled as high art no matter what, making it sound good is only optional. High art music or serious music is not about the actual music content, but the cultural context in which the music is listened to. For instance, film soundtracks are not generally considered as part of this category, despite their preeminent symphonic content in many cases, and that's because they don't belong to the same social contexts, or in other words, they are not composed for music halls.
Now wait a second. Are you implying that if we play film music in a concert hall, it automatically turns into art music?
It's just a way of speaking. Film music and other types of music are already played in concert halls sometimes, but a musical scene is more than just the physical space. It involves a musical community with its practices and expectations. In other words, film music is not generally consumed in the same manner as the classical music, or at least not yet.
Number 4. Classical music as, classical. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, we could define classical as tradition in style or form, or based on methods developed over a long period of time and considered to be of lasting value. While every culture and artistic style may have their own classical periods, in the Western art tradition we reserve this term for the so-called classical antiquity related to the old Greco-Roman world. However, when it comes to Western music tradition, the classical period label is normally used to describe the music composed between around the 1750s and the 1820s. The reason is simple. While there is always been physical evidence of what old Greco-Roman art looked like, that wasn't the case for the music apart from a bunch of surviving theoretical writings. And even today we can only speculate about how old Greek and Roman music actually sounded like. So at some point in the 19th century, music theorists decided that the closest thing to a classical style in Western music regarding long-lasting values was the aforementioned period from the previous century. This conception was obviously conditioned by their own historical view and context and could be up for debate, but nonetheless the classical talk remains today as a convenient label in musicology, just like equivalent terms are used to name other musical periods. So what do you think of these definitions? Let me know in the comments and see you next time.